And we're live. Good morning, everybody. It's Friday. You made it through the holiday week. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. Come on in, pull up a chair. Let's talk some food safety. My name is Bryan Armentrout, and I'm with the Food Leadership Group. And if you are here for the Food Safety Chat Live. And we do this every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, where I'm at in chilly Colorado, where I believe Allen's 10 below currently. And I'm joined today by Allen Sayler, expert in all things food safety. So, Allen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Coming to you from just outside of Washington, D.C., and we are a balmy 49 degrees, but by tonight we're down to 10. So the wind has switched to the north, going up to 45 miles an hour, and so we're going to get cool, but nothing like most of the nation.
Yeah, it's been So we're coming out of it tomorrow, and it'll be the same here. It'll be back up to the mid 40s. So kind of typical for Colorado. So everybody, one of the things that you'll notice with this chat is this is a conversation. This is not a presentation. We're here every week to talk about a new food safety topic, and I'm always excited when Allen's on because he's just a encyclopedia of knowledge in this space. So we're very happy when he's able to join us. And this is a wonderful opportunity to expand your food safety knowledge and invest in your company and your career and your future and get these types of questions answered. And with that, and I always want to do this, so let's dive in right away with our ceremonial toast. Everybody, please join us. Grab your favorite beverage. Cheers, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Always good. And let's just dive right in here, Allen, because I mean, one of the things, and this is always what's kind of nice about this time of year, and it's kind of a paradox if you work in food safety, in that this is a perfect time of year to sit back and reflect and look at the year, all the different things that were happening. But the ironic thing too is when you work in food, Allen, a lot of times this is the busiest time of year, right? So you're putting out the treats that go in Costco and all of these other type of things. And it's super, super busy. And you have to be careful if you're working in quality assurance and food safety, because this is when mistakes happen, right? Corners are getting cut. Sanitation doesn't have quite as long as they normally have for cleaning, and things get missed. And so food safety never rests, right? We're always on duty, aren't we?
Well, that's a very good point. And, this is the time of the year that many times your A team, what do they want to be doing? They want to be on vacation. And it doesn't mean that all of us can't be on the A team, but sometimes we have people that, through experience, just for other reasons, really are your go-to people. And so you are not only facing probably increased production in many cases, but you're doing it with maybe a less skilled staff, less skilled supervisory and frontline staff. And, it's just the recipe for a potential problem that you hadn't encountered before.
Exactly. Good morning, Brandon. Thank you. Nice to see you here this morning. And everybody, please let us know where you're at in the world. I'm always amazed by this, right? I'm in Loveland, Colorado, as I mentioned earlier, and Allen's in the DC area. So we have people who join us from all over the world, which is part of the fun of this conversation as well. So, as Allen and I were kind of mulling over the topics for today, and that's always part of the challenge, right? Is how do you keep it narrow, right? So you have a scope that you can talk about for an hour, because as anybody who's on this chat knows, time goes like this. And one of the things that we were talking about is really kind of looking at the year in review and FDA and what happened with them over the last year and what you need to be looking at in 2023 moving forward. So with those stats, I mean, what are you kind of seeing, Allen, as the regulatory story for 2022? What kind of pops for you?
Well, I'm gonna refer to a few others first, and then I'll tell you kind of my take on some of this in summary fashion. I just did a quick review on the website to see what some of the stories might have been or were in 2022 about FDA. And for instance, in January, story: food safety falls short in the U.S. consumer groups say. And this is an article where based on contaminated beef. Now that's USDA, but it also goes on to talk about some of the FDA problems way back in January. That's how we, let's say, started our year in some ways. In April, we had a story on FDA Food Division fails to regulate health and safety. And it's by an organization called Politico. Some of you may have seen some of their articles. Then we move to July. Food safety system falling short in a magazine called Industry Week, which some of you may get. And it talks about the FDA's pace of organizational change and training its staff is falling short. And in fact, if it continues at the pace it's going at, they will never catch up. Now, that's what this article says. Then you go down to September, and it says lack of key considerations in FDA food chemical safety. Now, I know a lot of what we focus on in these discussions is microbiological, but this article is simply saying FDA is falling short in the area of chemical food safety. And finally, we have, and throughout this, we've had FDA saying they are doing different things, smarter era of food safety, frankly honest. So I don't want to say this is the whole story, but I'm giving you a sense that there's a lot of concern out there, probably even all the way to Congress, about FDA, and it's not FDA entirely, but FDA CFSAN, which is in charge of food safety. And there are a couple of other centers, maybe veterinarian medicine a little bit, but it's really food safety and CFSAN. That's where I used to work, where it seems that they've got the regulation now, right? We've got the preventive controls. We've got these other FSMA regulations. That's all we needed. Well, the industry rapidly adapted to that, but it's interesting that the agency itself didn't seem to adapt rapidly to enforce it. So that's part of what I think this story is, that I'm giving you what I think other people are seeing. Now, do I have somewhat the same view? I think a very short answer. Yes, I do. I think there's, now why is that important in our topic today is really the problem for many of us is, and many of our senior management people, if we have an FDA inspection or a government inspection and we do okay, then apparently we're okay and we'll produce safe food. And what we need to be conveying to our senior management is that if that is their attitude, we need to educate them about the fact that right now it appears FDA, whether it's resources, training, I don't want to be critical, but let's just be realistic, is not the benchmark to measure whether we are achieving a program that can deliver food safety on a consistent basis. That's really my message, Bryan.
And everybody who's listening, and good morning, Stephanie, good morning, Allie, and of course, Tim, good to see you guys. So I want to really emphasize what you just said there, right? Is a lot of times in management, right, we get this syndrome where, you know, the quality department and food safety, we manage the audits and things like that. Then management comes at the end and says, how do we do? And if we did well, then they automatically jump to the conclusion that everything is okay. And audits are always just a snapshot. And this includes FDA, right? They're in on a particular day, they're looking at particular things, and then they're out of there. And in some ways, right, that can kind of hamper your activities, right? So if you have a big concern that you're worried about in your facility and FDA or a third-party auditor doesn't see it or doesn't recognize it, then senior manager goes, oh, see, everything is fine. We're good. You worry too much, right? And well, number one, part of it, we're paid in food safety to worry, right? We're trying to prevent things from happening. And a lot of times that assumption is really difficult in Allen to fight uphill.
Well, yeah, it is. And with that perspective that FDA should not be used as a benchmark as to whether we're doing great or not, what about these private third-party certification systems like SQF and BRC, IFS 22,000, or IFS and FSC 22,000, and there may be others as well. We've got NSF and we've got ISO and so forth. And the answer is yes, they're all helpful. And I'm not saying diminishing, don't pay attention to what the FDA inspection or inspector, but even in total with the private and the public, we still are not, we can't use them as our total benchmark. We have to, so that it begs the question, well, how do we know what we're doing? Are we doing enough? And I think we're going to get into that a bit later, but I just want to hit a couple of statistics I pulled off the FDA website. As far as overall compliance, and this is food, overall compliance from 2017, this fiscal year, so October to September, to 2022, which ended in September 30th this year, a few months ago, the overall compliance for the companies they inspected, and I'm not sure what they used to say compliant, not compliant, was around 90 to 92%. But when you look at the hazard analysis, which I know we're going to drill into, the compliance of the hazard analysis that they inspected at the various food facilities was only 79%. the identification of preventive controls, right? This is a preventive control regulation that was first published in 15. So we are now 7 years into it, or you could say if you're very small, you're not quite that far into it. And identification of preventive controls, only 74% of the firms got it. Now, you can say, well, that's more than 50%. Well, does 74% food safety, does that mean that the other 26% of the time we're okay if we don't get the food safety right? And then process controls. Process controls, one of the key, usually these are where the kill steps or where the magnets, metal detectors are, those kinds of key processing steps. Only 85% of the companies are getting it right. So just Bryan, some food for thought for you.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, because if you put it in those terms, if I'm going to the grocery store and 1 out of 4 items may not have a very good food safety plan backing it up, that's not good.
So, yeah, exactly. And so it's easy for someone like me or you, Bryan, to gather these figures and point out where we seem to be. And that's what we want to do. We wanted to look back, where are we? And then how can we do better? And that's, I think, the rest of the discussion today is what kind of tools do we have? How can we do better?
Yeah. Well, before we dive into that, Cortland had a question here for you, Allen. Do you think that the retirement of certain folks has severely weakened FDA?
I think the retirement has had an impact. I think we do have a generation. We see these generational shifts where one generation leaves and another comes in. And FDA has always been vulnerable because they seem to get authorizations from Congress to do large hirings at the same time. And while there's attrition, a lot of people come in, they stay with the agency, and then they retire about the same time. So I think that has something to do with it. I'm going to go out on a limb because I really like my old agency, CIFSAN. I think they are doing a lot of things more than what they possibly can with the resources they have. But can they do better with the resources they have? I think the answer is yes. And I think part of the problem is leadership. COVID diverted and pulled staffing away from CIFSAN, both in the field and in the headquarters in Washington, D.C. And as a result, everybody was kind of on just autopilot for a long time. Well, over time, unfortunately, in the industry, we have a number of members that they don't need FDA. They know what they want to do to achieve food safety, and they do it very well. But we do have a smaller subset that really needs a little bump and encouragement and mentoring from time to time. And I think we've lost a lot of that. I have to say that I've been out in the field a fair amount in 2022, and I've seen just amazing programs by the industry without much, encouragement by FDA. And I've seen programs that are completely inadequate, not just a little, completely inadequate. And that was after an FDA inspection. So.
Well, and part of this too, right, is the purpose of FDA going into visit, right? Because there's different types of audits for FDA, right? If they're going in and just doing a GMP audit versus a for-cause audit, they might not even be looking that closely at your food safety plan. And FDA investigators are people too, and they've got a lot of work to get done, and they have a lot of places to visit, and it may not get the attention, which kind of gets back to our point, right? Which is just because FDA comes and looks at some stuff doesn't mean that you're doing it correctly, right? And you can't use that. You can't use that as a defense either, can you, Allen? So let's say, for example, FDA comes in and everything looks fine, and then you have a recall 6 months later, and then you say, well, hold on, FDA was just here, and they said everything was fine. They're going to be like, no, we didn't, right? We just came in and give an investigation. It's up to you to make sure everything is correct. So definitely with this data, and I like, right, because you can get, and there's just some amazing graphs here that we've been referencing here when we were preparing. FDA's got a really good site, right? So if you do a search for FDA audits, there's a tool now where you can graph out information, look at this. And Allen made an important point earlier that people sometimes get confused because FDA's calendar is not the January to December calendar, right? Their fiscal year ends at the end of Q3, beginning of October it starts. So if you're comparing apples to apples and you're saying, well, my recall numbers are different than what FDA is saying, when you look at it, that's why. So just make sure you keep that in mind. And to your point, Alan, in this data, right? So with these recalls, you're seeing, kind of this repetition, and we see this all the time when you look at this data. I look at this all the time. And hazard analysis is one of those things that just repeatedly comes up. And, it's obviously super important to your food safety plan. It's going to be tied into your supplier approvals. It's going to be tied into your foreign supplier verification. Your hazard analysis is critical. And if you get one thing right in your food safety plan, do you agree then that your hazard analysis needs to be that thing?
I really do. And I think it's the analogy of putting a skyscraper up. The way many skyscrapers are built is there's a core, the core being the elevator or elevators, and then the floors are added on as the building rises. In food safety, if you think of the elevator area, the structural core of food safety being the hazard analysis, and then you add the other things on, all of the facility cleaning, equipment cleaning, the master sanitation schedule, pest control, environmental monitoring, you go on and on. Those are like the separate floors. So we are building probably a 30 to 40 story skyscraper. But if the central core area hazard analysis is weak, these floors will tend not to support themselves and collapse.
Exactly. And with that central elevator shaft in your skyscraper, it's your preventive controls, right? So, and this has been kind of interesting watching how the terminology is changing, right? So CCPs and preventive controls, right? The same thing, and FDA is moving more and more to just calling it preventive controls. So your allergen controls, your sanitation, your supplier verification, if you're ready to eat, your environmental monitoring, these type of programs are the things that FDA is always going to look at if they're coming into your facility to do a PC review. And it's really important that you understand those things. And a lot of times too, and I'll bring this up at this point because I talk about this quite a bit, is always remember two key things. Is your quality program and your food safety program are different, right? And you need to think about those things differently. Weight control on your product is not food safety, it's food quality, right? And you need to control those programs appropriately. And then making sure that you understand, and this is something, Alan, that drives me nuts, is make sure you understand who you're selling to. Okay? So if you're Abbott Labs and you're making infant formula, who are you selling to? General population? No, you're selling to infants, right? And your hazard analysis needs to reflect that. If you're making a product that's targeted to children and your hazard analysis says general population, you're fooling yourself. That is woefully inadequate way to look at things.
Well, an excellent point. And one of the things about a hazard analysis is we have many times people have one hazard analysis for their ingredients, which come from suppliers and packaging, and then another hazard analysis for the processing steps. I think that's totally appropriate. Yep. If you don't do it that way, not a problem. But if you integrate it into one, that's fine. But if you do that, you rapidly probably have an aha moment that, wait a minute, I don't know much about this ingredient, and yet I'm supposed to determine whether there are biological, chemical, or physical hazards. And, it's so easy to say none. And I will tell you, none for me or any third-party auditor or FDA, that is a red flag. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It means you better be able to justify why in a particular ingredient you put none for chemical hazards, none for physical hazards. And so this is just as a side note, in the statistics that I did download, FDA found that roughly between 90% to 93%, 94% of the supply chain management programs are compliant. Mm-hmm. I find that absolutely fascinating because my evaluation of supply chain management programs in the companies I go into usually fall short. And especially when I ask them, okay, you're getting an ingredient, let's just say vanilla, because it's not something that I've worked with recently, but I know a lot about. Okay, so how do you know what the biological hazards might be associated with vanilla, the chemical and the physical? Well, I've never been to Madagascar. I've never been to Mexico. I've never been to Tahiti where they grow the beans and then they do the various things that result in fermentation. And then we finally, at some point, do a chemical extraction and get the vanilla. Oh, wait a minute. Did we say chemical extraction? Does that mean there's a possibility we could make a mistake and have a chemical contaminant or impurity in vanilla? And yet, again and again, because a lot of it's alcohol-based, they say there can't be any biological, can't be any chemical, and there can't be any physical. So just a point.
Right. And you need to do those evaluations, right? And just simply gathering the documentation is not necessarily enough. I remember I was evaluating a new supplier and looking at their hazard analysis, and they were in the Philippines, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I got them on the phone and started talking with the owner and saying, okay, can you kind of walk me through this? And after about 15 minutes of my badgering him, he said, hey, Bryan, listen, I'm going to be honest with you. I hired a local kid from the university here in Manila to put together my food safety plan because I want to sell product in the U.S. I don't know any of the details here, right? And I was just like, whoa, right? Did that supplier get approved? No, right? And you have to look behind the surface and look at these type of things. And I think in some ways too, right? There's resources out there that can help you in these type of things. Appendix 1, right? And it's kind of funny how this has been truncated down now to this, we just call it Appendix 1, right? So FDA created a guidance document to help people to look at the physical, chemical, and microbiological threats for certain categories of different products. So if you are buying spices, right, you need to be looking at contamination in the spices, to your point, Alan, for chemical contamination or microbiological or physical, right? What if you're buying spices that are ground? The chances of something being put in there that you don't know about go up exponentially. We're all familiar with the allergen issue that happened a number of years ago with ground cumin, where somebody thought it was a bright idea to grind up peanut shells to kind of, cut the product and make it cheaper. Well, now you've introduced an allergen, right? And it's caused a major uproar here in the U.S.
Yeah. Some other things are what is emerging. And, we can't be on top of every single press release, scientific journal, and article or master's thesis or PhD doctoral thesis that may change the landscape of biological, physical, and chemical hazards. But we do need to, I get about 30 journals, magazines, monthly magazines. What I really like, it's fine to get the scientific journals, but what I really like is the professional magazines. Those stories are about 3 pages long. I can scan them within 1 minute, see if there's anything more. I can actually scan the table of contents in a minute, see what's in there. And so many of these are free. You just sign up for them. I've actually got a list of journals and professional magazines I use to try and keep current. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the mold issue. Okay, so many of us are thinking about microbial hazards or chemical hazards in the microbiological framework. In other words, toxins, right? We know staph produces toxins, B. cereus produces toxins, Clostridium botulinum produces toxins. Well, guess what? Mold produces toxins. And so we don't, rarely have I ever seen anybody consider mold from the standpoint of mold produces mycotoxins, which are carcinogenic in most cases, not in all cases. And we've recently had a recall because of mold where FDA tested the product. They found carcinogenic mycotoxins in the product.
Yeah.
And you can say, well, mold is just one of those things. Maybe we scrape it off. Maybe don't worry about it. But FDA in the FD&C Act has a provision that is not just food safety, it's wholesomeness. And they take that and they run a wide circle of what wholesomeness is.
Exactly. Right. And so, where would these mycotoxins come from? Think about a dairy farm, right? So you have a farmer who has a pile of silage and, he's feeding this to his animals and then, been going through kind of a wet period and you get some mold growth in there and then you don't necessarily see it. You feed it to the cows. Voila. Now you've got this in the product.
Yeah. So I think that the other thing, and by the way, if people are interested, Bryan, in that list of magazines, just if they'd reach out to you, I'd be happy to share it. and they're easy to find. It may not be all comprehensive. There may be some others out there. So if it's not on the list, it doesn't mean it's a bad one or not a good source. Maybe just I'm not aware of it or I didn't update my list. But with the internet today, let's go back to our vanilla.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I am supposed to figure out, is there any reasonable likelihood? So should I put a microbial hazard into my analysis for the ingredient vanilla? Should I put chemical? Should I put physical in there? Well, today you've got you've got YouTube, and it is, people kind of chuckle. YouTube, Wikipedia, you got to be kidding. But you know what? If I need information, I need it quick, and I need a general sense. It's not that I would use this as a reference in a scientific paper, but if I need to know more about vanilla, I might go to Wikipedia and to YouTube, and there's some really good information there. So never, we live in an era today where visits to the library are not needed any longer.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, the shorthand way I always say this, right, is that your hazard analysis needs to be written up, and it needs to be in that table format that FDA is familiar with, however you want to arrange it, but show your work, right? So if you say, okay, here are the hazards I'm concerned about in vanilla, have a page at the end of your food safety plan that has all those links. And when FDA says, okay, Mr. Armentrout, can you please explain to us why you're worried about this particular chemical threat in vanilla extract? Yes. Here's an article I found from last year where they were doing some analysis at Consumer Reports or whoever, right? Where you can then reference it and add that to your information. And that's, this kind of references back to why we wanted to talk about this here at the end of the year, because going into 2023, you need to be re-looking at your hazard analysis and doing this all the time, right? Because right now we're just talking about the particular attributes of the products, but there's also the facility, right? How many times, I'm sure you've seen this too, Alan, right? You go and you visit a facility. I would do this with my plants, and I go to the plant and there's a brand new piece of equipment there in the process. And you're like, what's this? Oh yeah, we bought this. The engineering guys found a screaming deal. They found this vat in an empty field that they got for nothing, right? And you're just like, what, right? Where did this come from? Was it used with allergens? All these type of things. And one of the things I would always train my food safety teams on is nothing happens in this plant without your blessing, right? You need to drill it into the management team, and the plant manager needs to support this, that there can be no changes to the process, no changes to the equipment, all these type of things in your prerequisite and preventive programs, unless the food safety team reviews it and signs off. And that's hard.
That is, and I think that is really important. I hope that the people listening today think more about that. It sounds like a simple thing, but it's easy for us to blame suppliers, right? So yeah. we were unhappy. We didn't get questionnaire back. We didn't like the answers they provided. So we almost become an FDA, and we can hold our suppliers' feet to the fire, yet we don't know anything about their process. And meanwhile, the elephant in the room is the way we are managing our processes, our equipment, our facility, Bryan, like you said.
Yeah.
And you say, well, FDA came in and never really said anything about that. And I'm sorry to get back to that, but there's another piece of data. We know from the COVID issues, FDA pulled their field staff in, and now they're out.
Yeah.
The gates open, they're out. And if you look at the pre-COVID numbers, FDA was doing around 8,000 inspections, preventive control inspections in 2019. Of course, COVID hit in really for a lot of us in March. So we are now, which was reductions, and of course there was for cause. So 2021 is for cause. 2022 is hard to read because it was for cause, and then roughly the last, not quite half of the year, we are trying to get back to norm. And so what are the numbers like? They went from almost 8,000 in 2019, 2022, we are around 2,200. So what is going to happen, and we know what's going to happen. The FDA inspections are going to be skyrocketing, and they're going to find more because maybe some of us have been doing a little bit of coasting. Maybe we've thought like your colleague in the Philippines, your client. And I do want to point one other thing out about sources. There are the scientific, there are the journals, there are the publications, the monthly trade publications. But Bryan, you mentioned Appendix 1. I'd like to suggest that almost all of you that are on are probably PCQIs, and that's Preventive Control Qualified Individuals. If you're not, that's okay. Go to the manual. You can download it online. We can provide the hyperlink if you haven't. Chapter 8 is all about how to do a hazard analysis. Chapter 9, process controls. Chapter 10, allergen. 11, sanitation. 12, supply chain. And then I would strongly recommend that if you want to learn the mechanics a little better, Appendix 2 has got food safety plan examples. And Appendix 4. Appendix 4 should be printed out in total and put on your bulletin board. It has got the microbiological information that FDA uses, their inspectors use to determine whether it's likely that a pathogen is going to be able to survive in your food, survive an ingredient. Can they grow under the conditions that you're providing and processing? Appendix 4 is absolutely, and the beauty is if you use that as part of your justification for whether it's a microbiological hazard or not, what is the FDA inspector going to do? Well, we don't use that anymore, not to my knowledge.
Right, and so as you can see here in my copy, Alan, right, all my posties and everything in here, right, and this is one that Appendix 4, limited conditions for pathogen growth, right, gold, absolute gold, and you made an important point, Alan, in that always when you can use FDA's own data, because are they going to argue against themselves? No. Are they going to challenge a secondary study that you read about online on a website and some guy talking about on YouTube? Yeah, could be, right? But they're never going to challenge themselves, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So use that every time you can. And one of the things that you need to look at here as well, too, and with my Philippine story, this becomes kind of relevant as well, is emerging threats, right? We're in this incredible period of innovation right now, with all of these different new products that are in the marketplace. Is it a hamburger or is it plant-based? Here's a plant-based drink. Here's all these type of things. There's companies now that are growing sushi without the fish, right? They are growing up cell cultures and then producing a fantastic fillet that sushi restaurants are using. What are the risks with that? If you're trying to put together a food safety plan, where do you even begin with something like that, Alan? I mean, brand new novel technology. So you have these things that are mimicking other things, but they're not those, right? So how do you then put together your hazard analysis for those type of things?
Well, you know what? The same way, except the problem is we don't understand all the processes. As you said, in these cell-based foods, some of the newer innovative plant-based foods, except that has a little more history that we know a little more about. What about precision fermentation? We're not talking about bioengineering, but there is bioengineering and bioengineered foods.
Yeah.
We need to understand that. Now, if we are working for the company, we have access to all this proprietary information, and we can make probably some very good decisions based on whether there's unusual microbiological, chemical, or physical hazards. But for many of these foods, particularly some of these that are cell-based growing, they're in vats at temperatures that are conducive for the cells to grow. Precision fermentation, they're in vats that are encouraging the growth of maybe bacteria, maybe yeast, maybe molds, who knows what it is. And these are temperatures that in most cases, what you just showed us when you held up the Appendix 4 of the PCQI manual, it's the same temperature range that these pathogens love. And also, what do I have to feed to get the precision fermentation to be successful, or the cells to grow in a cell-based media of some kind? And I may have to add things that generally are not used in the food industry as a chemical to make something grow. And so how do we clear that chemical if there is some toxicity to it? Sometimes we have to stop growth. So we have to add a chemical to stop growth that we don't want the consumers to get in whatever the food is. So how do we wash out that chemical? So this is all, the technology's new, the fundamentals of evaluating food safety have not changed.
Good point, right? And so kind of like my previous example, one of the best ways to start understanding this is talking with the potential supplier. One of the golden rules in quality is that suppliers are much more cooperative before they get paid. Meaning that if the procurement group is looking at a new potential supplier and contracts haven't been signed and money hasn't yet exchanged hands, that's your window, right? They want to do business with your company, and that's when you're going to get the most compliance with them. So sit down with their food safety people at their facility and say, okay, this new product that you're selling us, teach me about this. What are you controlling? What hazards have you identified in the process? Number one, it's going to educate you on that, what you need to be worried about. And number two, it's giving you window into their expertise. Do these people know what they're talking about? Right? And you need to figure that out. Because whenever you're evaluating a new supplier, Alan, it always kind of breaks down to a two-tiered process. Step one is your first swipe, right? Do you have the basics in place? Do you have a food safety plan? Do you have this type of information? I want to see it. And if they come back and say food safety plan, well, what is that, right? Okay, next, right? You're not doing business with these people. Then if they pass that first round, then you start digging deeper into this information. And they need to be able to explain to you so that you can understand it. What are the risks that they're managing so you can understand those? Because part of this too, right, with supply chain preventive controls, they may have a hazard that they think you're controlling for. You better know that.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. And one of the things I'm curious about, Bryan, is you've done a lot of hazard analysis work for various companies. I've done that. I'm curious for those people that are listening to us today, where are their concerns, their sticking points on a hazard analysis? I'm going to leave that out there. And I know you've got a mechanism for people to feed in questions and information. So I'd really like to hear from those listening today, or advice. Maybe there's something that you've learned and that would be helpful to everybody on our discussion today. I can tell you that, I was just in a facility recently, and they use fruits that have pits, except the fruit that they get is not supposed to have pits. When I looked at their hazard analysis, when you looked at this particular ingredient and you looked at physical hazards, there were none. And as I was talking with the staff, guess what they occasionally found in the finished product? Pits.
Right.
And so I thought that was interesting. That was almost too easy, because whoever did the hazard analysis was not connected to the production people. And of course, production people are not expected to know about a hazard analysis. But when you're doing these, you need to talk about what the realities are in your facility. And maybe the answer is not in a scientific journal or in the PCQI manual. It may be out on the production floor with somebody actually doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's see here. So Cortland had a comment here for you. When will CFSAN, so Center for Food Science and Applied Nutrition, gain training from CBER, especially if reverses airflows, thus increasing adulteration? What is CBER? I don't know what that is.
Center for Device and Radiological Evaluation, Regulation, or something like that. It's device and radiological. I think it is. If I'm not, please correct me, because there's a couple of agencies that have acronyms that cover medical devices, radiological health, and things like that. Well, I think there's a great point there. Do we actually evaluate error in a hazard analysis? The answer is, if it is not used in the product, in contact with the product, or to move the product before it's packaged, generally we don't even look at air as a hazard. It falls within the broader prerequisite, you call it preventive control, but it's really not a prerequisite program for compressed air, ventilation. You could even put, I've seen some companies put all utilities together. So you see the gases, the compressed air, the ice, the water, all of that put together, obviously dealt with slightly differently, but within one program. So is FDA, one of the questions I always ask is, I want to know if they're monitoring pressures in rooms and where air is used. I don't think that's commonly asked by most auditors, inspectors. So I don't have a very good answer to that question. Is there a lot more work needed, both by FDA as well as the industry? I think so, yes.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of gets into an earlier point we were talking about as well, Alan, where if the plant is going in and doing work, right, and modifying their production environment, throwing in some new equipment, expanding their area, that system may no longer be adequate. It may not be putting out enough CFUs to push out from that room, right? Which is what you always want. You want your GMP controlled area to have the highest pressure so that the air moves out. You never want air being sucked in. So if you can look at those things, those are always really helpful.
Yep. And go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, while the hazard analysis and the follow-up preventive control summary document are the core, the elevator shaft of the skyscraper, there are some other things that can get us into trouble very rapidly. And in the environmental monitoring area, what can be very frustrating is trying to find the root cause. And as we vector, and then it comes and goes, is it a resident strain? Is it a transient strain of Salmonella, Listeria, or something else? That's really very challenging. And we could use a lot more information in the industry about that and case studies. One of the companies I worked with had a very good environmental monitoring program. When you have a good one, you find things, and they were finding things, and they thought they were killing things off, and they did find some fundamental flaws in their equipment, and they addressed them, and everything was fine for about a month, and then we started getting some environmental hits again. And so, unfortunately, that is a program unto itself, a verification program that you can use in the hazard analysis, and you can use it to minimize, reduce, or eliminate that hazard, but it doesn't fit very nicely. So some of the things, I don't want to minimize the importance of the floors, in the skyscraper. So we've got the hazard analysis, but some of these other things are also very important. And am I still with us?
No, you're still there. Yep. Okay. There you go.
My whole screen went bleep. It did bleep. So anyway, to wrap up that point, what I was brought in to do then is they've looked at all these other things, very competent people, a lot of experience. And, I'd love to have had this, masterful resolution of this and find the root cause solution. And you know what it was? Equipment legs on the floors. And if you looked at their equipment legs, they had anything you could think of. And none of them, there was hollow tubes within hollow tubes, there's open seams, there were threads, there were all kinds of things. And so as you are trying to understand and do a proper job of your hazard analysis, you have to understand the process and you have to understand your equipment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's an unfortunate thing, Alan, and you've seen this time and time again, and Alan is an expert in equipment design, is that most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, equipment used in food manufacturing is designed for speed and efficiency. It's not designed for sanitation and cleaning, right? And so a lot of times you have to go back and fix things. And again, back to my earlier comment, the time to fix things is before you hand a check. So that's when you have your highest leverage. And again, right, going further back in our conversation, if you find it when it's sitting on the floor in the plant and there's product running through it, too late. You need to find about these things up front. Just a couple more comments here. So Cortland had a comment on my environmental thing. So some things need to be reversed to keep adulterants in the room, similar to radioactive materials, right? Well, thank you for that, right? And this just kind of shows knowledge is contextual upon what you're talking about, right? So I'm thinking about environment in terms of food. Cortland's talking about it in a wider category with medical device and potentially other things that you don't want getting out of the room. So that's a good clarification. Thank you. Jennifer had a comment here. My concerns with hazard analysis. CCP gets lots of attention, especially when they go wrong, but prerequisite programs often can go crazy and don't get the attention they need, 100%, right? Which is why a lot of times when you see it, and it gets to that point, Alan, where you have a warning letter, right? And it's always kind of divided up into the sections, right? So you have the beginning of the warning letter where FDA talks about their authority, right? According to Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, this, that, and the other thing. Therefore, your product is adulterated. It's adulterated because of, And then there's always a section in there on GMPs, right? Because you aren't doing these things correctly, it is impacting your larger program. So Jennifer's point is a great one, is that skyscraper has to be solid, right? You just can't say, oh, no, I've got a good hazard analysis for my preventive controls, my CCPs, and I'm all good. No, absolutely not. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and there's some statistics regarding supply chain or regarding GMP compliance, and FDA has found that GMPs, we train every year. The staff is tired to hear about it. Some of us think that GMPs are just employee hygiene when it's not. It's much broader. But FDA is still finding GMP problems. And I'm not saying we're going to ever hit 100%, but we should certainly be striving. It's the old adage of the first 90% is relatively easy to achieve, and then the last 10% can be very difficult to achieve. So, it's a challenge, but I would challenge you to look at as objectively as you possibly can, as objectively as humans possibly can. Sometimes we are not very objective, at your program and at your staffing and at your supervision from a food safety lens, and see where your weakest links are. There's this program, or there was a program on TV about the weakest link. I think we know what the weakest link means. And do we have weak links that we can have a very well-written hazard analysis, great prerequisite programs that are supporting it, and yet we just continually face problems? And I think one of the things, I have no inside information, so I think I can just say this generally. I suspect that at the Sturgis plant at Abbott, Sturgis, Michigan, I suspect it was not one cause that created the problem. It was many. And of the many, I suspect personnel were part of it. And so, that is a whole different topic as far as evaluating people and their capabilities and understanding and placing them in the right positions. But I always, say that not everybody was cut out to do food safety. Not everybody was cut out to be on the processing line in a food processing plant. Our mentalities just are not there. So that's important in getting this all put together properly.
Mm-hmm. And back to our theme for our show today, right? This is the perfect time of year to start reflecting and thinking about these things, right? Is because, and again, we talk about this time and time again on here, is food safety is the responsibility of everybody in the plant. As the food safety professional, you're leading the activities in these areas, but it's a team effort, right? Food safety culture, right? That we talk about a lot. So with this, right, if you're in this role, you're the thought leader looking at these type of things and these emerging hazards. And we talked about earlier, right, these different novel type of foods. And part of this now too, we see this quite a bit as well, is this weird characterization of things as superfoods, whatever the hell a superfood is, right? So the marketing guys came up with this concept. So companies are always trying to come up with a new and novel way to differentiate their product in the marketplace. So they're coming up with new ingredients and new different things, right? And we talked about this last week with Bill Marler and this potential with this Terra and this ingredient from Peru, right? And we still don't know why this made people sick and caused liver failure, but it was very serious, and we're trying to figure this out, right? And this is not the point in time you want to figure these things out, right? You want to figure these things out in advance. And a lot of times there's extreme pressure to get these things on the market, right? So it makes it even harder for the food safety team, which again makes it so important to have a good network and be able to talk with other people and do the research and talk with the suppliers. Because, Alan, I'm sure you've seen this as well, right? If you think as the food safety professional, you can sit in your office and figure all this stuff on your own, ain't going to happen, right? You need the network.
True. Very true. And the taro root is a much better example than the vanilla I was using earlier, because if we're going to add that as a new ingredient, we need to understand how it is processed, how it is grown. And if it is causing liver failure, kidney failure, things like that, it's a toxin. So what kind of toxin is it? Could be natural to that food. It's possible. We know that some plants have serious toxins. The mushroom family. Every year we have people that go out and harvest mushrooms. Maybe it's the first time, maybe not. And they then sell these mushrooms. And if you don't know what you're doing and you use mushrooms in your foods, some of the toxins in mushrooms are unforgiving. In other words, it's not like, well, I'll quit eating them and then I'll be okay. It's like I quit eating them and I look for a liver transplant because it's destroyed my liver and at very low levels. So could this taro root have the similar properties? Well, we darn well better know before we use it. The other thing is, in some third world countries, when you're looking at chemical hazards, FDA said if you source an ingredient from the US, you generally don't have to put herbicides or pesticides into the chemical hazards equation because there is such tight control between EPA and FDA and others that it's not that it couldn't happen, but it's highly unlikely we will get chemical hazards related to pesticides and herbicides that will contaminate a food. If you source from outside the US, all bets are off. And guess what high levels of pesticides and herbicides do? They cause liver and kidney damage.
Yeah. And if you don't know what you're looking for, it's hard to find it, right? Because as we all know, sending out things to laboratories and having them do all kinds of chemical analysis, man, that adds up fast. So you have to be able to narrow that down quickly. And trying to do that in the middle of a recall and you don't know what the issue is, man, that's a bad situation to be in. Something else then for people to think about here with 2023. Hey, guess what? New allergen, right? So now you have sesame. Sesame has been added to the list. Did they take anything else off? Nope. Now you have to worry about sesame too. So you need to be looking at everything and saying, okay, what are the potential vectors for sesame in my products? Do we have anything? Do we have any derivatives? What's going on with this, right? How are we labeling this on our products? Have we updated our labels? Do we need to, right? Do I need to send out new notifications to my supply chain to see if they are dealing with sesame in their supply chain? These are the things you need to be looking at in 2023.
That's excellent. And, one of the thoughts I had right away is, well, I don't use sesame seeds. So that's really easy, Brian, if you were sending me a supplier questionnaire. But what I don't understand is that sesame oil is commonly used in the food industry in a lot of ways. And if it's highly refined and I have a letter, then that I don't have any of the protein in that oil, then we're good. But if I don't know or haven't asked the question and I simply answer your questionnaire, no, I don't use sesame seeds because that's my mindset, that really isn't the question that you were asking. And I may have misunderstood it. Also, what do you mean sesame? I was just getting used to coconut. In fact, I've been in facilities where coconut wasn't even understood to be an allergen today. Of course, we know that, but
coconut, yeah, that one's a weird one, right? It's on the list. Is it really an allergen? My personal opinion, right? This is just me talking, right? The evidence that FDA had to put that on the list was pretty dubious to begin with. So we'll see. Things are always added; they're rarely taken away. So make sure and keep that under control. So part of this, right? And I think it's kind of time to bring this back to the 30,000 foot level, because part of the conversation here today was to kind of level set relative to your plan and then dive down into the topics and then come back up. And that's exactly how you should be doing things with your hazard analysis, is you need to be sitting back and looking at it and saying, okay, this is the perfect time of year to look at my hazard analysis. It is the bench, it is the frame, it's the elevator shaft in my entire program. Is my program correct? What new things should I be looking at? How do I need to evaluate this with my team? What are the things I need to be doing? Because the bottom line on this is what we all want is to be able to sleep at night, right? And that's kind of always been the acid test for me, right? Is, okay, can I go home at night and sleep knowing that I've got a good program in place? Now, is that ever going to be 100%? No, and it shouldn't be, right? Because if you're at 100%, you're complacent and you're probably fooling yourself, right? So hazard analysis is a perfect example of what you need to be looking at for continuous improvement. And thinking about these things and saying, all right, let's start from scratch. Throw out the hazard analysis and let's completely rewrite it and see if it matches with what we had before. Odds are it's not going to.
Yep. And the complacency point you made, I think we all think we're doing much better. Maybe you have a few gaps here and there, but we're certainly better than we were last year or 5 years ago. And I think we are, but let me give you some data. In 2022 fiscal year, there were roughly class 1 and class 2 for FDA only. There were roughly about 170 recalls. How does that compare to prior years? That was higher than every year except 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wait a minute. Why would we have more recalls when the staff isn't even really out there? And if you look at the details related to our hazard analysis conversation, of the recalls, and these are not class 1 or class 2 broken down, but just recalls, 54 were based on chemicals or foreign objects. 102 were labeling and allergens. That doesn't surprise us. 82 were microbiological. That's interesting because we tend to focus more on getting the microbiological right. And then 27 were on other hazards. So I hope we aren't complacent and say, hey, this is 22, we're going on 2023. We already got this thing down. The data doesn't show us that.
Yeah. Here's another good food for thought that I constantly harp on is around half of recalls for foreign material are for non-metal items. So glass, rubber, things like that. So if you're sitting back and saying, hey, you know what? I've got a metal detector. I'm good. It'll catch everything. Nope. Not even close. Not even close.
Yeah.
X-ray. Well, maybe not, right? Depends on your density differential. Maybe you got a good system. Maybe you don't, right? Now's the time. And that's the point of the theme today, right? That I'm pounded on this, right? Is now's the time to go back and reevaluate, right? You got hopefully a little bit of calmness right now before you gear up for 2023. You need to start thinking about these things. Because also, Alan, I mean, there's groups out there. There are consumer groups that just randomly pull things off the shelf and test, right? Consumer Reports will pull products off the shelves and test for things. And if you're not prepared for that, you're in for a rude awakening. You need to be ahead of that.
Yeah. And, you know, Consumer Reports is a good example. Some of the major recalls that have had the most impact in our industry in the last 10 years, actually states sometimes were the ones. It wasn't FDA that it was a state testing something. And I know when I was working for a state, we never had money to hardly test anything, but some states do. So I guess as we are getting toward the wrap-up time, and we've already started that, is really look at your hazard analysis, understand the ingredients and the processes and the equipment, understand from your suppliers. If you can't get understandings through YouTube, you can't get understandings through professional journals, magazines, scientific articles, go to your supplier and ask them. Now, granted, they may be unwilling to provide a lot of details. What happens if you get the ingredients from a broker? The broker may have no answers on, but you are responsible. I always say this, if you're the PCQI and things go really bad, you're very possibly the one going to prison. So
right. It's your name and reputation on the line. You are the preventive control qualified individual. And one of the things that I think is going to be coming with FDA is that one of the things I think companies don't necessarily do a good job with is, remember, the PCQI has to review and sign off on the preventive controls on that product once it's manufactured, right? I think 5 days is what you have to do that. And FDA, I think, in the future is going to look at that a lot closer, right? And again, this goes back to my thesis that FDA is moving the food industry closer and closer to medical device standards, right? And these type of things are coming. So you better be ready for those. Cheryl, sampling scoops for QA left behind, gaskets, yep, all the fun things. We've all got all kinds of fun things for those type of activities. So, Alan, fantastic conversation as always. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure.
And so Alan, of course, is with the Center for Food Safety and Regulatory Solutions, CFSRS. There we go. I make that get out correctly. And I'm with the Food Leadership Group. And let's see. So one of the things I found out, Alan, last time we were doing this is that the links in here were getting removed. So I'm going to try an experiment here, and we'll see if this works. So one of the things that I have as a locals group to help people, keep up to date on these issues. That's exactly why we're doing the food safety chat here as well, is to keep people ahead of the curve. So I've thrown the link in here for the Food Safety Foundation locals group. So it's the foodsafetyfoundation.com or .locals.com. There we go. And it's free. Join that. And I'll put out notifications 2 or 3 times a week on recalls and things that catch my attention, like enoki mushrooms, right? Oh, every week, right? Do not eat enoki mushrooms, right? Every week it's another listeria recall with those things. Emerging risk, right? So something that you always need to be aware of. What's your email, Alan, if people would like to reach out to you?
Absolutely. It is A Sayler, so it's ASAYLER, A Sayler at, and then that crazy acronym you put out very accurately, CFSRS. So it's Charlie Frank Sam Richard Sam.com. So
Okay,
not long.
I like it. So I'm going to put it here in the comments. I put a space between the @ and the address here, and we'll see if we can get around the LinkedIn algorithms here. There we go. Hopefully that works. So perfect point to wrap on this. Another fantastic conversation. Thank you, everybody here. December 23rd, you're here, you're showing up, you're managing food safety, and we appreciate everything that you do. You're growing your knowledge, and we're happy to help with that in any way that we can. So everybody, please have a fantastic Christmas. Enjoy your holiday. But as we said earlier, food safety never rests. So of course, we'll be back here next Friday, the 30th of December, for the next food safety chat. So join us at 10 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain Time. And if you're an early bird on the West Coast, 7 a.m. Pacific, and we'll bring up the next topic. And again, Alan, have a fantastic Christmas, my friend. Thank you for everybody for attending. Have a great time, and we'll see you back here next week.
Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.